Greetings and welcome to another Moment of Truth. My name is Marcus Miller, and today we will focus on the historical component of biblical context as we continue to explore the four approaches to the Bible experience. History is like a snapshot in time, and while we do not possess the details of every single moment, the Bible does provide us with sufficient records of specific events that occurred once upon a time. So, we're going to take some time to consider the following elements. And first up, let's look at the writer, right? One element of historical context or the historical component would be a writer or speaker. And in some cases, when you look throughout the Bible, in certain books, you may find that the writer may be the same as the speaker. But in a lot of cases, you may find that there may be a differentiation, right? There may be a distinction between the two. And some of them may be more obvious than others. So, one example of like the writer would be the five books of Moses. Okay, um, it is the general consensus that Moses, God gave the five books of the law, right? The Pentateuch. There are different references to those first five books, but gave them to the people, to the Israelites, through Moses. So they're considered the five books of Moses. But you'll find that sometimes throughout those books, you may find that there are angels that are speaking or what have you. So that's one example of that distinction there. But again, the writer would be identified as Moses. Now, the other example is the Apostle Paul. You'll find that a lot of the epistles that were written in the New Testament are attributed to the Apostle Paul. And so you'll see either he addresses it, as he's talking, or who he's talking to, which brings me to my next point, the audience. Right? So sometimes not just who the writer is or who the speaker is, but also who it's addressed to. So, speaking of the Apostle Paul, we'll kind of look at this. If you didn't know, these are epistles. What you see listed here, they're known as epistles or letters that were written to these different places. And so, Romans was the book of Romans actually represents the letters that were written to the church that was located in Rome. Corinthians is another example, which represents the letters that were written to the church that was located in Corinth. So all these churches, they were located in these different areas. And the Apostle Paul wrote these letters to these different places. Galatians to the church of Galatia, Ephesians to church of Ephesus. And you get the point looking at the rest of these. So the audience, again, just represents who it was actually addressed to. Okay. And sometimes the audience changes within certain books. So, but this is all part of the historical context, okay? The historical component of the biblical context. Moving on to the next part, or next element, would be culture, right? So, culture, you can kind of find some information in there about the culture, and really throughout the entire Bible, you'll find that most of it is giving us information about the Jewish culture, the ordinances that they had to keep, the traditions that they had, what what they could eat, their dietary intake, things like that, right? So that's kind of laced all throughout the scripture. You hear, for example, the circumcision was a huge part of that. It was part of the covenant, and that was part of the Jewish culture. Okay, so that's just an example there. All right, the next element is economy. So interestingly enough, you do find references to offerings, tithes, right, in money terms. Well, even when it pertained to the temple, for example, there was a certain economical approach, especially to the maintenance of the temple. You can see that there was this approach even when it came to offerings, for ransom offerings, what have you, in Exodus, or you may see when they tried to reestablish the temple and maintain it in Nehemiah. You see these examples, right? And some of the terminology that you may see for like currency, for example, would be like a mite, the widow's mite. Okay, well, that's what you see in the upper left corner. That would be an example of a mite. At least that's what I found. So you may find something a little bit different, but I don't think it'd be too far off from that, right? The bottom left would be is considered an ancient penny, from what I could find. And you'll see the larger picture here on the right side is an ancient shekel. So, pretty interesting story about the shekel. Shekels were a matter of currency for quite some time. In fact, if you look at it, the first mention of it in the Bible was during the transaction between Abraham and Ephron, the Hittite, in the book of Genesis. And Abraham was trying to purchase a field to bury his wife. And so, as they were negotiating what the price would be, the term shekels was mentioned there. Shekels were also required as a ransom offering, as I mentioned a moment ago, for people that were ages 20 and above. And you find that in Exodus. It is also believed that the temple tax became a requirement in Nehemiah, again, mentioning that earlier, which amounted to a half shekel. Now, at some point, the value may have gone down to a quarter, but then rose again to a half around the Roman time. And shekels were used as currency by the Jews during their revolt against the Romans in AD 66 to 70. So shekels have been around for quite some time. But interestingly, recently Israel announced a new Israeli shekel. And according to some sources, it is worth a quarter of, or approximately a quarter of, a U.S. American dollar. So that's pretty interesting. That again, shekels is still around, whatever they're worth before, as opposed to now. They've definitely been around quite some time, and this is an Israeli form of currency. So there's a tidbit of information there for you if you didn't know that. Moving on to the next element, it would be geography. So this can be interesting too when you're looking at the geographical aspect of the Bible from a historical standpoint. So you hear of places like Jericho and Canaan and Egypt and Sinai, Babylon, Bethlehem, Galilee, Damascus. I mean, you name it. There's so many places that were mentioned throughout the scripture. And so just to kind of give us a little bit of a glimpse of where these places are, because just hearing them or just reading them may not give you as much of a perspective as seeing it on the map, right? So like I mentioned, and you can kind of see here, hopefully you can see my arrow, but here is Jericho. Okay, there's Bethlehem right here, and you can see Jerusalem is not far off. In fact, Jerusalem is the capital. There is Samaria. You've heard of that place before as well. And also way up here in the top right would be Damascus. So you have that place too. Moab is right here. The Ammonites, where Ammon is right here. Hebron, right? This is a place that was mentioned in the scripture. So, you've got a few places, and you can kind of orient yourself here on a map where they are. Okay, there's much more to, Canaan is this long strip here. Okay, but of course, there's more to this map. You've got Egypt that would be further to the left of this, and we may see that on the next image that we have here. Yep. So here you go. You see Canaan here again. You got Jericho up here. Okay, and if you go way over here, you've got Egypt. And what's interesting about this one is it kind of gives you a little bit of a visual on the route that the Israelites took when they left out of Egypt. So they stayed here in Goshen. That was the place where the Israelites lived. And when they left, they kind of went this route here, crossed over the Red Sea, and then of course they were all in the wilderness, just traveling, right? And so eventually they came to Jericho. which is up here, and then of course there you have to Canaan. Okay, so this kind of gives you an idea, right? It should give you a bit of a perspective, or a better perspective, I should say, as to the locations of these places, because just reading about them may not give you that visual, but you can kind of see it here. And it's just interesting, if you pull up a current map or modern map, you may see that the peninsula itself is not too much different, especially when you're talking about Canaan. Of course, they're what they're labeled as, the cities and towns and what have you, are going to differ, but as far as its shape and its position, it's not too much different from what I can tell. I'm not a professional in this matter, but I saw a lot of similarities. So that gives you hopefully a little bit of perspective from the geography standpoint as an element of the historical component of biblical context. Moving on to the next item would be politics. So interestingly enough, you see politics all throughout the Old Testament, especially when you're talking about the establishment of kings and their interactions with the other countries and rulers and what have you. And one that stands out to me though is Esther, who maybe, I guess it's debatable whether you would consider her a politician, but by virtue of the fact that she was a queen, right? And so she may not have been the king, but she was married to the king. And at the time during Esther, there was a big deal, if you remember, when it came to Haman and Mordecai, and Haman's hatred towards the Jews and his desire to really just to get rid of them. And so Esther played a big role in that, because she had to approach the king and convince the king that this was an issue, and of course make it so that the Jews, somehow that would get reversed. And if you read the story, you look in the book of Esther, you can see that. So in a way, that was a political move, okay, on behalf of the Israelites. All right, so you kind of see that in there. You'll see also some information about genealogy. So Luke chapter 3, verses 23 through 38 gives us somewhat of an extensive view of the lineage of Jesus Christ, at least from the earthly side, right, from the natural side, all the way back to Adam. So that's pretty phenomenal that Luke took the time to do that. You'll also see some information in there about chronology. Genesis 1 is a perfect example of that, because it tells you, as much as it's debated, it tells you that the creation of the world occurred in 6 days, and it tells you chronologically how that happened. Now, most times we talk about chronology, we're thinking in terms of years, but even from a day perspective, day by day, Genesis 1 gives you that play-by-play view of creation, all right, as far as like what happened on each day. So it gives you some sense of that. The next element would be language. All right, so language is pretty interesting here, and we'll focus on this a little bit and try to break some of this down. Remember that what I'm referring to is the historical context, the historical component of biblical context, right? So captured in time, everything again about the writer, the audience, the culture, the economy, the geography, the politics, the genealogy, the chronology, and even going into the language. This is all part of the biblical context from a historical standpoint. So let's look at language, right? So one part of language, you have morphology. What is morphology? Well, as you can see here, it's a study and description of word formation and language. So what's an example of morphology? Well, I have one here that's provided, that if you take the word cookie, for example, right? Cookie, C-O-O-K-I-E, and you add a suffix, which would be the letter S, well, then the word changes. It morphs from cookie, singular, to cookies, plural. Okay, it changes now. Even the meaning changes slightly because you go from one individual cookie to a, you know, group of cookies or a package of cookies. So that's an example of morphology. Okay, moving on to grammar. Grammar is the study of the classes of words, their inflections and their functions and relations in the sentence. What is that really? To summarize that, basically grammar is the structure, okay? The structure of how we put words or how we build our sentences. All right, so um, that goes without saying. You know, everything from punctuation marks, you know, and depending on what language that you're talking about, determines how complicated that can be. I think in the American language we have our own complexions, complexities when it comes to grammar. But then when you talk about the other languages, especially the ancient languages, there's some things that may not have existed that may make it a little bit more complicated to identify what these words were and also what they meant. Okay. You have the next one is syntax, right? The next part of language. So when you talk about syntax, the way in which words are put together to form phrases, right? So basically, the the normal structure of a sentence, when you talk about syntax, how we arrange our words when we form a sentence, it usually consists of a subject, a verb, and a direct object. Okay, that's kind of like that formula that we use to, you know, to build our sentences, to arrange our sentences. So that syntax falls within the grammar, right? To make it grammatically correct, syntax is a part of that as far as the arrangements of words in our sentences. Then you have lexicography. It's a big word that basically means it's the composition of a dictionary, right? Because you have to identify what do these words mean. Moving on to etymology. Etymology is one of my favorites because it does trace the history of that word. So we kind of went through a few things talking about the, again, all of the components here, the elements of history, the writer, the speaker, audience, culture, economy, geography, politics, genealogy, chronology, language. It's a lot of stuff, right? But you can pull all of that. Now let me say this. All of these aspects or all of these elements are really they're quite obvious because again, they're embedded in the content and they formulate the context of the written content, okay, of the Bible. So when you see that, if you're studying, because this is what we were talking about before, if you looked at the previous episodes, we've been talking about methods of studying the Bible and, you know, what to take into consideration. Well, these are aspects of the historical component of biblical context, and just that snapshot in time that helps you to see, okay, what was said, what did it actually mean then. But even in knowing that, you have to know that just because you understand who said it, who it was intended for, what the culture was like, you know, what was going on, what location, all of those factors doesn't necessarily tell you the application. That's a whole nother aspect, okay? So these are just some of the more obvious things you can pull or extract from the Bible from a historical standpoint, okay? Now I've said enough about that. This concludes today's moment. And if the Lord permits, we will meet again next week to focus on the final component of biblical context as we continue to explore the four approaches to the Bible experience.